An elderly black couple approached the first-class gate only to be stopped cold by a flight attendant who decided without even checking that they didn't belong. Charles and Evelyn Carter didn't argue. They didn't raise their voices. Charles simply pulled out his phone, sent one quiet message, and sat down without a word. Minutes later, the very airline that thought they could dismiss them would be scrambling because the Carters weren't just passengers, they were the owners. Before we dive into this unforgettable story, comment below where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a story that reminds us. Appearances can be deceiving, suitcases and hurried footsteps into a familiar, busy symphony. At Gate 17, a cluster of passengers had already begun to gather, their faces buried in phones or leaning against carry-ons. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee from a nearby kiosk, and the tang of jet fuel wafting in from the runways beyond the windows. Through the throng of business suits and designer handbags, Charles and Evelyn Carter moved with an unhurried grace. They were an elderly black couple, perhaps in their late 60s or early 70s. Their every movement marked by quiet confidence. Charles wore a neatly pressed navy blazer over a crisp white shirt, and Evelyn was draped in a soft cashmere shawl, the color of ivory. Her pearls, small and simple, rested against the fabric like a memory of more elegant times. In Charles's hand were two first-class boarding passes, which he carried with a casual, almost absent-minded hold, as if the thought of being questioned had never even crossed his mind. Evelyn looped her arm through his, a small but tender gesture. She squeezed gently every few steps, and each time Charles's lips twitched in the faintest of smiles. At the gate behind a sleek podium, Amanda Brooks stood with her arms folded neatly across her chest. She was the lead flight attendant for Flight LN 402 to New York, and had worked her way up over the past decade through discipline and a sharp eye for detail. Amanda prided herself on maintaining standards and unspoken code of who belonged where. The moment her gaze settled on Charles and Evelyn approaching the first-class boarding lane, something inside her stiffened. Her eyes quickly scanned their modest clothes, their slow pace, their lack of showy accessories. No designer handbags, no sleek business laptops, no loud conversations about mergers or investment portfolios. They didn't fit the picture Amanda had somewhere deep inside her of what first-class travelers looked like. Without even realizing it, her mind began writing a narrative. Economy passengers who had wandered into the wrong place. Maybe a mistake at check-in, maybe something worse. She pressed her lips together, adjusting her blazer as if to prepare for an unpleasant confrontation. The clipboard in her hand felt heavier somehow. Amanda didn't look at the names on the pre-boarding list, though it would have taken her less than a second. She relied instead on instinct. The same instinct that had served her, or so she believed well enough over the years. Meanwhile, Charles and Evelyn remained unaware of the judgment swirling around them. Charles guided Evelyn gently through the crowd, careful to shield her from jostling shoulders and dragging suitcases. He offered a quiet, "Pardon me," here and there, his voice smooth as worn leather. At one point, Evelyn stumbled slightly on the edge of a rolled-up carpet, and Charles immediately steadied her with a firm, reassuring hand. She looked up at him, her expression full of gratitude, and squeezed his arm again. He answered with a soft chuckle, one she'd heard countless times before, the kind that said, "I'm right here, always." Behind the gate counter, Amanda Brooks watched this small, private moment between them, but it did little to soften the suspicion already seated in her mind. She pasted on a thin smile, already preparing the words she might need. There must be some mistake. Maybe they were upgraded by accident. Maybe. The announcements overhead crackled again, signaling final boarding preparations. The gate buzzed with activity as more first-class passengers lined up, suits, laptops, polished shoes, all validating Amanda's sense of order. And then, with a soft, certain confidence, Charles Carter stepped forward, offering their boarding passes. Amanda barely concealed the tightening of her jaw as she reached for them. Something was about to unfold, and not even Amanda Brooks, with all her instincts, could predict how wrong she was about to be. Amanda Brooks straightened her posture as Charles and Evelyn Carter approached the boarding lane. She clutched the boarding passes in her hand, glancing at them with mechanical detachment, barely a flicker of her eyes across the printed names and seat assignments. Her focus wasn't on the tickets, it was on them. "I'm sorry," Amanda said firmly, stepping in front of them with a polite but unmistakable wall in her voice. "First class is reserved for premium passengers only." Her tone was even professional, but sharp enough to slice through the air between them. She didn't raise her voice, but the implication was clear. "You don't belong here." Charles paused, the faint smile he'd worn faltering just slightly. Evelyn, still hooked onto his arm, offered a gentle, understanding smile as if she had encountered moments like this before. Without hesitation, she reached out and offered the boarding passes again, this time with deliberate calm. "Our seats are in first class," she said warmly, her voice carrying the steadiness of someone who refused to be rattled. Amanda didn't take the time to verify anything properly. She glanced once more, quick, perfunctory, as if the paper itself was an inconvenience. Her lips pressed tighter. She shook her head. "There must be some mistake," Amanda said, forcing a sympathetic tone that barely masked her irritation. "Maybe an upgrade at check-in. But this area is reserved for our priority elite members." The words hung heavily in the air. Passengers standing nearby began to notice the tension. A woman in a tailored gray pantsuit glanced up from her phone, her eyebrows knitting together as she sensed something wasn't right. A young man in a hoodie backpack slung over one shoulder paused his music, slipping one earbud out as he leaned slightly to listen. Murmurs began to ripple quietly through the small crowd. "They don't look lost," someone whispered under their breath. Another man seated nearby pretended to read a magazine, though his eyes darted over the pages, flickering toward the standoff at the gate. The discomfort was palpable now, thick enough to be felt even by those trying hard to look away. Charles Carter remained composed, though a tightness formed around his jaw. He exchanged a glance with Evelyn, who offered a slight reassuring squeeze of his arm, the way she always did when tempers threatened to surface. Her gesture was enough to ground him. Amanda, oblivious to the growing unease around her, folded her arms across her chest, her clipboard tucked like a shield. She had no interest in debating this. To her it was simple. First class meant a particular kind of image, an image she didn't believe the Carters matched. "I'll have to ask you to step aside," Amanda said, her voice carrying the authority she believed she had earned through years of training. "We need to board our qualified passengers." Qualified. The word cut deeper than any shout might have. Evelyn Carter's smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes shifted the same way a calm lake surface tightens before a storm. She nodded once, a gesture almost regal in its simplicity. "We'll wait," she said softly. Her voice measured, kind, but filled with the kind of patience that only comes from decades of understanding how the world sometimes chose to see them. More eyes were on them now, some filled with curiosity, others heavy with guilt. But no one spoke. No one challenged Amanda. No one stood with Charles and Evelyn Carter. Not yet. Amanda, sensing no immediate pushback, turned her attention back to the boarding process, as if the interruption had been successfully neutralized. But what Amanda Brooks didn't realize was that the smallest ripples often signal the strongest storms, and this storm was only just beginning. Amanda Brooks pressed her clipboard tighter against her chest, her patience wearing thin. She took a step forward, closing the distance between her and the Carters with an air of finality. "I'm sorry," she repeated, her tone growing more clipped, "but you'll need to move to the economy boarding line immediately." Her words were no longer veiled with politeness. They were commands delivered with the full force of someone used to being obeyed without question. Charles Carter stood his ground. His calmness hadn't cracked, but the lines around his eyes deepened slightly, betraying a quiet strain. He tilted his head, offering Amanda a dignified smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Would you mind verifying the manifest, ma'am?" he asked evenly, voice low and respectful. "Our names should be there." His request was simple, measured, reasonable, yet it landed like a challenge. Amanda's lips tightened into a thin line. She exhaled sharply through her nose, barely restraining a scoff. "There's no need," she said, waving the clipboard dismissively. "I've been doing this long enough to know when someone's in the wrong section." Her voice carried, reaching the ears of the small group of passengers who had been subtly watching from nearby seats. The woman in the gray pantsuit shifted uncomfortably. The young man with the hoodie pulled his second earbud out completely, now pretending to check his phone while clearly eavesdropping. Amanda continued, emboldened by her authority. "It's not about the list. It's about understanding who fits." Where she said her words dripping with finality. "Please step aside." Charles inhaled slowly through his nose, steadying himself against the anger that flared somewhere deep in his chest. He knew better than to escalate here at the gate in full view of judgmental eyes. Beside him, Evelyn gently squeezed his arm again. Her touch, a silent reminder. Dignity, always. Across the carpeted boarding area, a junior flight attendant named Lily Turner stood near the check-in podium, her body half turned toward the scene unfolding. Her uniform was crisp, but her demeanor betrayed her youth. Shoulders drawn in slightly fingers, fidgeting at the hem of her jacket. Lily had seen the manifest. She knew who Charles and Evelyn Carter were. She remembered their names being highlighted during briefing. She remembered the captain himself mentioning VIPs boarding today. But fear paralyzed her. Amanda Brooks was a senior flight attendant. She had a reputation not cruel but commanding. She handled problems without hesitation and expected everyone under her to follow her lead without question. Speaking up against her, especially publicly, could mean disaster for someone like Lily. Maybe Amanda would figure it out soon, Lily told herself desperately. Maybe it would all sort itself out without me stepping in. Still, a sick, sinking feeling twisted inside her chest as she watched Charles and Evelyn being shooed away like they were unwelcome guests at their own party. Amanda gestured again, impatient. Please, this isn't up for debate. You're holding up boarding. Charles Carter straightened to his full height. His stature, once athletic, had softened with age, but there was still a regal strength in the way he carried himself. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply looked Amanda in the eye and said one thing, "Very well." Then, with a grace that Amanda mistook for submission, he turned with Evelyn and stepped aside. The passengers nearby avoided their eyes. No one spoke. No one intervened. The murmured whispers that had started earlier now rose slightly in volume, buzzing like an undercurrent of shame that no one dared to address. Amanda exhaled in satisfaction, convinced she had restored order. But what she failed to realize, what she was too blinded by assumptions to see, was that she had just made a mistake so catastrophic that no clipboard, no seniority, and no protocol would ever shield her from the storm it would unleash. And at that moment, Lily Turner finally looked down, unable to bear the sight of what she had just allowed to happen. The stage was set. The real boarding had only just begun. Charles Carter led Evelyn gently toward a pair of empty seats near the edge of the boarding area. They settled down without fuss, though a few curious glances from nearby passengers trailed them like whispers in the air. Charles pulled out his phone, its screen lighting up softly in the dim terminal glow. His fingers moved with a surgeon's precision, tapping out a short, deliberate message. No anger, no demands, just a precise communication to a contact whose number he knew by heart. Issue at Gate 17. Situation unfolding. Discretion advised. He hit send and tucked the phone away without fanfare. Beside him, Evelyn reached for his hand, squeezing it once, a small, wordless affirmation that patience would prevail. A few feet away, Amanda Brooks leaned against the gate counter, flipping through the clipboard as if it were a shield. Another flight attendant, Megan Flores, sidled up next to her, a cup of coffee in hand. Amanda didn't lower her voice much. "Can you believe the nerve of some people?" she muttered loud enough that nearby ears could catch snippets, trying to sneak into first class like nobody would notice. Megan gave an uncomfortable chuckle, not sure how to respond. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, her eyes darting toward the couple who sat calmly nearby. Amanda smirked clearly, emboldened by her own self-righteousness. "You can spot them a mile away," she continued, tapping a manicured nail against her clipboard. "Economy written all over them. No offense, but you know the type." Megan's smile faltered. At that same moment, a subtle ripple moved through the boarding area. The businessman in the tailored navy suit who had earlier watched the exchange now sat stiffer in his seat, his phone angled discreetly on his lap, its camera quietly recording. Across the aisle, a young woman with pink headphones, pretending to scroll through social media, tapped her camera app instead, tilting the phone just enough to catch Amanda's animated gestures and the Carters' dignified stillness. Passengers who had originally averted their gazes were now paying attention, and this time, they weren't looking away. In the background, the rhythmic hum of boarding announcements and the click of rolling suitcases continued, masking the tension that grew thicker by the second. Charles noticed. He always noticed. He leaned slightly toward Evelyn and whispered, "We'll let the facts speak louder than anger." Evelyn nodded, her smile small but sure. Amanda, meanwhile, continued her chatter. "I've been working first class for 10 years. I can smell a free upgrade a mile away," she said to Megan, who responded with a weak laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. Another attendant. Jason Meyer lingered nearby, catching enough of the conversation to feel the knot tighten in his stomach. He looked at Lily Turner, who stood frozen at the edge of the gate, still clutching her clipboard like a shield. Lily's knuckles had turned white. Her gut screamed at her to say something, to step in to fix the growing disaster. But Amanda was a senior. Her word carried weight. Lily was still on probation. The wrong move could cost her everything. Instead, she remained silent, haunted by the image of Charles and Evelyn sitting alone, isolated not by choice, but by judgment. Amanda's voice floated through the terminal again. Well, at least now we won't have any riffraff cluttering up the premium cabin. Another uneasy ripple through the onlookers. Phones stayed up now, cameras rolling. A silent trial was beginning not in courtrooms but through quiet recordings ready to be broadcast beyond Gate 17, beyond the airport, beyond anything Amanda Brooks could ever control. And still, Charles Carter sat in serenity, a fortress of calm in the middle of a storm brewing just beneath the surface. He had already played his move. Now the rest would unfold exactly as it should. The boarding area buzzed with a thin veneer of normalcy. Rolling luggage low murmurs the occasional shuffle of boarding passes, but underneath a different current was rising. At Gate 17, the air felt heavier, thicker, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath. Then the gate phone rang. Its shrill tone cut through the terminal's muted symphony, snapping heads around in its direction. Amanda Brooks, still leaning on the counter, glanced over her shoulder with mild irritation. She nodded at Megan Flores to grab it. Megan picked up the handset, pressing it to her ear. A beat. Then her face drained of color. She turned slowly, covering the receiver with her hand, and whispered, "Amanda, it's the captain. He wants to speak with you immediately." Amanda furrowed her brow. "Captain Sullivan, about what?" Megan shook her head, whispering urgently, "He said it's not optional." Passengers near the counter subtly perked up. Phones that had been recording shifted ever so slightly, now fully fixed on the scene. Amanda straightened her posture, smoothing her blazer with practiced hands. She offered Megan a dismissive smirk. "Probably just another delay or paperwork nonsense," she said loud enough for a few passengers to hear. But Lily Turner, standing stiff as a board near the back of the gate, knew better. She had seen the way Megan's hands trembled slightly as she set the phone down. She caught the way Jason Meyer's eyes darted toward the Carters, then quickly away. Something was happening, something serious. Amanda gave her clipboard a theatrical toss onto the counter and marched toward the jet bridge with the same unshakable confidence she had displayed earlier when denying Charles and Evelyn their rightful seats. As she disappeared down the hallway, a strange silence settled over Gate 17. The businessman shifted in his chair, lips pressed into a thin line of satisfaction. The young woman with pink headphones lowered her phone slightly, sensing that the best part was yet to come. Even Megan, still rooted behind the counter, glanced around nervously, her clipboard clutched to her chest like armor. Lily gripped her own clipboard tighter, her nails digging into the cheap plastic. She knew this wasn't routine, this was fallout. This was the moment where all the whispered doubts, the gnawing unease, the uncomfortable glances that had rippled through the gate earlier, they were about to solidify into something real, something official. Down the jet bridge. Captain Derek Sullivan waited just inside the open aircraft door, a hard glint in his normally easygoing eyes. He had flown for 30 years and had seen his share of problems, technical failures, angry passengers, weather delays, but this was different. He tapped his knuckles once against his thigh as Amanda approached, her heels clicking with assertiveness. "You wanted to see me, Captain," she said, her voice sweet but taut with irritation. Derek Sullivan's jaw tightened. "In my office. Now," he said simply, stepping aside to let her pass into the galley near the cockpit. No pleasantries, no smiles. Amanda hesitated just a second too long, then obeyed. As the jet bridge door hissed closed behind them, the watching passengers and crew were left to wonder. Back at the gate, Lily exchanged a glance with Jason. For the first time that day, Jason gave her a slight nod, small, almost imperceptible, but enough he knew too. This wasn't about boarding delays. This wasn't about paperwork. Something had shifted. The system that Amanda Brooks thought she controlled was no longer hers to command. And somewhere near the gate windows, Charles Carter sat quietly, Evelyn's hand resting lightly on his knee, their faces, the picture of serene patience. They weren't moving. They weren't leaving. They were simply waiting for the truth to finish, doing its work. Inside the cramped galley near the cockpit, the sterile overhead lights cast a harsh glow on Amanda Brooks as she shifted uncomfortably, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Captain Derek Sullivan stood opposite her, a man built from decades of calm under pressure, but now even he seemed edged with a barely restrained tension. He cut straight to the point. "Tell me exactly what happened at the gate," he demanded, his voice low but unmistakably sharp. Amanda lifted her chin defiantly. "I was managing the boarding process," she said smoothly. "There was a mix-up with 2 passengers trying to access first class without the proper credentials." Derek's eyes narrowed. "And you verified that?" he asked carefully. Amanda hesitated a half-second too long. I used my discretion, she said, her voice faltering slightly. It was obvious they didn't belong. Silence. It was the kind of silence that felt like a rope tightening around her throat. Derek took a step closer, arms folding across his chest. So you didn't check the manifest? You didn't scan their boarding passes? You made a call based on what a feeling? Amanda flushed. I've worked here for years, she blurted. I can spot when something's off. It's intuition. The captain's face remained impassive, but Amanda could see the change in his eyes, a quiet, cold fury building beneath the surface. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded printout. Without a word, he held it up between them. It was the updated passenger list. First class seats 1A and 1B. Names printed in bold, Charles Carter and Evelyn Carter. Amanda stared at it, her mouth going dry. And in case you're wondering, Derek added, his voice steady as a blade, they're not just passengers. They're principal shareholders. They co-founded Carter Aviation Group, our parent company. Amanda staggered back half a step, as if she had been physically struck. Her heart hammered painfully against her ribs. No, that's not possible, she whispered. Derek dropped the paper onto the counter with a heavy thud. It's not just possible, it's fact, he said coldly. And because you decided you could tell who belonged in first class by looking at someone, you didn't just embarrass yourself. You embarrassed this airline. You triggered a corporate escalation. Legal is already involved. HR is watching this flight in real time. Amanda opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came. The crushing realization hit her all at once. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a minor slip. She had ignited a scandal that would ripple through the airline's entire leadership. Derek stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. When we land, you will not be greeting passengers. You will not be exiting through the main jet bridge. Security will meet you at the side gate. You will surrender your badge. Effective immediately. You're being pulled from active duty, pending full investigation. Amanda's knees buckled slightly and she grabbed the counter for support. Captain, please, she gasped. I didn't know. He shook his head once curt and final. You didn't bother to know. The words slammed into her harder than any raised voice ever could. Amanda pressed her trembling hand to her mouth, her mind spinning in dizzying circles. Somewhere back at Gate 17, Charles and Evelyn Carter had sat patiently, calm, composed, and silently dismantling everything she thought she understood about power and privilege. And now, at 30,000 feet, Amanda Brooks realized her fall wasn't coming. It had already begun. The heavy click of the cockpit door echoed behind Amanda Brooks as she stepped back into the main cabin. The first-class section loomed ahead just 20 short steps away. Yet to Amanda, it felt like crossing a desert with every eye, a burning sun scorching her every move. Captain Derek Sullivan's instructions were clear. You will apologize, you will do it properly, and you will do it now. Amanda's heart pounded painfully against her ribs as she forced herself to move forward. Each step sounded louder than the last against the soft carpeted aisle. The passengers, once absorbed in their conversations and devices, were now unmistakably alert. Heads turned, eyes followed. They had all witnessed the earlier scene. They knew who she was walking toward. Near the front, Charles Carter sat poised, his posture regal, yet relaxed, flipping through a magazine without real focus. Beside him, Evelyn Carter sipped from a porcelain teacup with the calm grace of a woman untouched by the surrounding storm. Neither of them looked up. Their silence was deliberate. Their silence was devastating. Amanda stopped just before them, clutching the edge of her apron like a child lost in a courtroom. Passengers leaned in from behind seatbacks, pretending to fiddle with seatbelts or adjust vents, all trying not to appear obvious in their eavesdropping. The young flight attendant, Lily Turner, peered anxiously from the galley, her clipboard forgotten knuckles white around its edges. Amanda swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, she began, her voice trembling so badly she almost didn't recognize it as her own. Neither of them acknowledged her. The silence pushed her forward, forcing the truth from her lips. I owe you both a sincere apology, she stammered, her cheeks flaming hot. I judged you unfairly. I failed to do my job properly. I assumed things I should never have assumed. Her voice cracked slightly and she hated herself for it. Still, the Carters said nothing. They didn't need to. Amanda felt their silence crashing down on her like a tidal wave, more powerful than any angry words could have been. She shifted awkwardly, feeling the hundreds of invisible judgments from the rest of the cabin settling like stones in her pockets. Each glance was a verdict. Each sideways look was a sentence. "I am deeply sorry," Amanda added, voice softening into a whisper. "It will never happen again." Charles finally turned a page in his magazine. That was the only reaction he gave, and it was enough to make Amanda's heart crumble. She stood there for another agonizing heartbeat longer, waiting, hoping for a sign of forgiveness. It never came. She was dismissed, not with words but with the absence of them. Amanda bowed her head, muttered a final "thank you," and retreated down the aisle. As she walked, she felt the burn of every stare trailing after her. The businessman near 2C shaking his head in disdain, the socialite in 3A whispering furiously to her companion, phones held low but recording. Even Lily Turner, once intimidated by Amanda's authority, now looked at her with something almost like pity. Amanda reached the galley and braced herself against the counter, her breath coming in shallow gulps. The apology was over. The humiliation was complete, and for the first time in her life, Amanda Brooks realized it wasn't anger that destroyed you, it was dignity. Silent, steadfast, immovable dignity. Like the kind Charles and Evelyn Carter had wrapped around themselves while she had torn apart her own. The plane began its descent, the cabin lights dimming to a soft glow, a low murmur of seatbelts clicking into place rippled through first class. Captain Derek Sullivan's voice crackled through the intercom, clear and professional, but carrying an undertone that made Amanda Brooks sit up straighter in her jump seat. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for landing, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the seatbelt sign is turned off. Additionally, all flight crew members are instructed to stay on board after passenger disembarkation for a brief debriefing. Thank you." The words hung heavy in the air. Passengers exchanged confused glances. Flight attendants stiffened. Lily Turner, standing rigidly near the galley, shot a worried look toward Amanda, who kept her eyes fixed firmly forward, willing herself to disappear. Amanda's palms were damp against her skirt. She knew what was coming. Everyone did. The wheels touched down with a smooth thud, the soft rumble of reverse thrusters pulling them safely along the tarmac. Normally landing brought a wave of relief, a small collective exhale from everyone on board. Not this time. The first-class cabin remained oddly silent. Passengers sat stiffly, some stealing glances toward Charles and Evelyn Carter, others looking at Amanda with a mix of curiosity, disdain, and something sharper judgment. The seatbelt sign dinged off. People gathered their belongings slowly, almost mechanically, but no one made a move toward the aisle, and then the gate door opened with a sharp hiss. Standing just outside, visible through the open jet bridge, were two uniformed security officers, their postures firm and unreadable. Amanda felt her stomach plummet. A third figure stood between them, a man in a sleek navy blazer wearing a silver badge from the airline's corporate security division. He stepped forward briskly, boarding the plane before a single passenger had set foot in the aisle. His voice was low, firm, and left no room for interpretation. "Miss Amanda Brooks." Amanda rose shakily to her feet, her face drained of color. "Yes," she managed to whisper. "Please come with us." There was no shouting, no confrontation, just a quiet, absolute summons. Passengers froze mid-reach for their bags, watching as Amanda was gently but firmly escorted toward the exit, past Charles and Evelyn Carter, who didn't so much as lift their eyes. Amanda kept her gaze down, feeling the full weight of every silent stare drilling into her back. Lily Turner clutched the galley counter, blinking rapidly, guilt flooding her features. The businessman who had watched everything unfold earlier crossed his arms and shook his head slowly, murmuring under his breath, "Too little, too late." In 3A, the socialite who had eagerly recorded snippets of drama earlier now looked distinctly uncomfortable, pulling her oversized sunglasses over her eyes as if to shield herself from the truth. Passengers who had sat in silence when they saw something wrong now shifted awkwardly in their seats, shame rising like a tide. The moment for intervention had come and gone, and none of them had done anything but watch. Amanda reached the doorway, pausing just before stepping out into the jet bridge. She turned back almost instinctively, searching the faces behind her for some kind of support, some kind of sympathy. There was none, only heavy silence. Charles Carter finally looked up just once and met her eyes with a gaze so calm, so unimpeachable that Amanda felt herself shrink under its weight. Not angry, not triumphant, just disappointed. It was somehow so much worse. Amanda stepped onto the jet bridge, the doors hissing closed behind her, sealing off the chapter she could never erase. Inside the cabin, life slowly resumed. bags pulled from overhead bins, muted whispers, phones buzzing with new messages. But something lingered in the air, a quiet reckoning, an invisible weight. Everyone on board knew they had seen something ugly today, and many of them would spend a long time wondering why they hadn't spoken up. Meanwhile, Charles and Evelyn Carter sat quietly waiting for the world outside to catch up. They had seen it all before, but this time perhaps someone had finally noticed. While the passengers slowly funneled off the plane, casting lingering glances over their shoulders, Charles and Evelyn Carter remained seated serene as ever. A junior attendant, one of the few who had watched everything unfold with growing unease, approached them cautiously. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice low and respectful, "please allow me to escort you to the executive lounge. Our senior leadership is awaiting your arrival." Charles simply nodded, offering Evelyn his arm. She accepted it with the graceful smile, as if they were simply attending another afternoon garden party rather than stepping into a storm they had every right to command. As they moved through the jet bridge, the world outside seemed to pause. Other airline employees along the corridor stiffened to attention, their eyes widening in recognition as the couple passed. Whispers followed in their wake. That's them, the founders, the owners, no longer invisible, no longer underestimated. Inside the executive lounge, soft leather chairs and warm lighting provided a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere just beyond its doors. Waiting for them stood a small delegation of executives, the Vice President of Customer Relations, the Director of Flight Operations, the Chief Diversity Officer. All wore the same expression, contrition mixed with urgent calculation. Charles and Evelyn were offered seats near a low glass table set with untouched coffee and bottled water. They declined the refreshments, choosing instead to remain standing. The Vice President, a man named Robert Jennings, cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he began, voice thick with nervousness, "we deeply regret the events that transpired today. This does not represent who we are as a company. We take full responsibility." Charles regarded him with a polite, cool detachment but did not speak. Instead, Evelyn stepped forward, her voice as smooth and firm as polished steel. "You say you regret it," she said evenly, "but regret without action is just theater." The executives shifted uncomfortably. Charles finally spoke, his voice low but resonant. "We did not build this airline to create another space where dignity is rationed by appearance. We built it so that everyone, no matter how they looked, would be treated with respect the moment they set foot on our planes." He let that hang in the air. "And today," Evelyn added, "you showed us that the work is far from finished." Robert Jennings swallowed hard. "What would you have us do?" Evelyn and Charles exchanged a glance, an entire conversation passing silently between them. Then Charles answered. "Mandatory anti-bias training," he said, "for every flight attendant, every gate agent, every supervisor, every captain." He took a step closer, his presence commanding without a hint of raised voice. "And not just a one-off workshop you can check off a list. We want continuous education, real accountability and leadership that looks like the passengers we serve." The executives nodded hastily, scribbling notes. Evelyn softened for a moment, her hand slipping into Charles's. "Not because we're angry," she said, her eyes glistening slightly, "but because dignity should not be a luxury. It should be the standard." The room fell silent. For a long moment, nothing stirred but the soft hum of the lounge's air system. Then Robert Jennings stepped forward again, his voice steadier now. "You have our word," he said solemnly. "Today will not be forgotten." Charles inclined his head slightly. "We'll hold you to that." As the executives hurried off to begin the slow process of turning promises into policy, Charles and Evelyn finally allowed themselves to sit side by side on the plush leather sofa. For a moment they said nothing. Then Evelyn reached over, resting her hand on her husband's. "Do you remember," she said softly, "why we started this airline?" Charles smiled faintly, the memories dancing behind his steady gaze. "Because we were tired of asking for a seat at someone else's table," he said. Evelyn squeezed his hand gently. "And because we wanted to build a place where no one ever had to." They sat together in the warm golden light of the lounge, silent witnesses to the quiet revolution they had just reignited, not with shouting, not with rage, but with unwavering, undeniable dignity. Weeks passed. The incident that unfolded at Gate 17 had long since traveled beyond airport terminals and into newsrooms, boardrooms, and dinner tables across the country. Clips taken by discreet passengers had gone viral, sparking heated conversations about dignity bias and what true professionalism really meant. Charles and Evelyn Carter, however, stayed away from the noise. They didn't grant interviews. They didn't seek headlines. Instead, they chose a different kind of influence, one that didn't clamor for attention but quietly demanded change. Inside the airline's main headquarters in Atlanta, a press conference was underway. Executives stood in front of a backdrop bearing the company's logo, announcing sweeping reforms with a tone of somber sincerity. Behind the scenes, Charles and Evelyn watched the broadcast from the executive lounge. Their faces were unreadable as the CEO stepped up to the microphone and addressed the gathered reporters. "Today we commit to more than apologies," he said. "We announce the Carter Initiative, a mandatory ongoing training program for all our employees, focused on dignity bias, recognition, and equal service to every passenger." He paused, clearing his throat. "This change is overdue, and it's thanks to two people who reminded us that respect isn't reserved for appearances or assumptions. It's a standard that must live in every moment for every person." As the cameras flashed and the executives pledged their reforms, Charles and Evelyn simply exchanged a glance, a private, knowing look. They didn't need applause, they didn't need recognition. Their work, like their dignity, spoke for itself. Meanwhile, at the airline's training academy across the city, a new class of flight attendants filed into a bright modern classroom. Among them was Lily Turner, the young junior attendant who had once stood paralyzed with fear as injustice unfolded before her eyes. Now she sat in the front row, notebook in hand, her eyes burning with determination. The instructor, a retired airline captain, stood before them, his voice steady. "Welcome to a new era," he said. "Here it won't matter what someone looks like, what they wear, or how much noise they make. Here we serve every soul with the same respect." Lily felt a surge of pride and responsibility as she scribbled down notes. She thought of Charles and Evelyn Carter, the quiet strength they showed, the lesson they had left behind. It would not be wasted. Weeks later, on a warm spring morning, Charles and Evelyn arrived at the airport once again. No fanfare, no entourage, just two travelers carrying worn leather bags and the quiet weight of a mission accomplished. As they approached the first-class gate, a new generation of staff stood ready. Lily Turner was among them, her crisp new uniform freshly pressed, her posture proud but humble. She caught sight of Charles and Evelyn and smiled, not with condescension, not with assumption, but with genuine welcome. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said warmly. "We're honored to have you flying with us today." Charles tipped his hat slightly and Evelyn offered her a gentle nod, their smiles understated but rich with meaning. There was no need for explanations, no need for tickets to be scrutinized or identities to be questioned. This time, dignity walked through the gate without resistance. As they settled into their seats, Charles gazed out the window at the runway, the sunlight glinting off the tarmac. Beside him, Evelyn unfolded a simple paperback novel, her fingers turning the pages with quiet grace. No words were spoken, none were needed. Across the intercom, the captain's voice announced the final preparations for departure. And as the engines rumbled to life, Charles reflected on the journey not just of miles but of decades, from fighting for a seat at the table to building the table itself. A soft smile played across his lips. Respect, he thought, isn't something you grant based on appearances. True respect reveals itself without asking for permission. And with that, the plane lifted into the sky, carrying with it not just passengers, but the quiet, powerful weight of a new beginning. If this story moved you, please leave a comment, sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one. The story of Charles and Evelyn Carter shows that making snap judgments based on appearances can lead to serious consequences, while calm dignity and unwavering self-respect bring true strength. It reminds us that unconscious bias and discrimination still exist in many parts of our daily lives, in workplaces and airlines and in countless everyday interactions. These quiet injustices often go unnoticed until someone has the courage to stand firm without shouting. In our personal lives, we should always choose to treat others with respect and fairness regardless of first impressions. In the workplace, we must actively foster environments where every person feels seen, heard, and valued. As a community, we must challenge bias wherever it lurks, not with anger, but with unwavering conviction and grace. By practicing values like respect and humility, we build a society where dignity isn't granted based on appearance. It's recognized because it's inherent to every human being.